4 Arleigh Burke destroyers, the Strait of Hormuz. Late July 2026. The United States Navy established a maritime interdiction cordon off the Iranian ports of Bandar Abbas and Chabahar, and it did so without a carrier strike group, without a cruiser, and without a single manned aircraft flying combat air patrol overhead. 4 guided missile destroyers, a screen of Saildrone unmanned surface vessels, and 1 amphibious assault ship positioned well outside the interdiction zone. That was the entire surface force. The blockade held for 11 days, then CENTCOM announced the lifting. Iranian oil tankers, which had been turned back or boarded at sea during the cordon, began moving again. The headline cycle called it a diplomatic resolution and moved on. That was the wrong read. The blockade was not the operation. Watch the DDGs on international waters patrol, dispersed, no carrier island superstructure on the horizon behind them. The 11 days were not the point. The audience was not Iran. Every outlet that covered the July 2026 Hormuz Cordon framed it as a pressure campaign against Tehran, sanctions enforcement, oil revenue interdiction, a coercive signal tied to the stalled Vienna successor talks. That reading is accurate as far as it goes, but it stops precisely at the point where the analysis becomes useful. 4 DDGs is not a Cold War blockade. It is not even a Gulf War posture. It is a demonstration package, and demonstration packages are not designed for the country they are pointed at. They are designed for the country watching. Beijing was watching. What the U.S. just rehearsed in the Strait of Hormuz, with minimum manned surface presence, unmanned sensor coverage, Aegis cooperative engagement, and a global interdiction authority that did not end when the cordon lifted, is the exact concept of operations the U.S. military has been developing for a contested blockade of Taiwan. The platforms are different. The geometry is different. The doctrine is identical. This is what the steel move in the Strait of Hormuz actually meant. And to read it correctly, you have to start not with Iran but with the problem the Pentagon has been trying to solve for a decade. The problem is this: in a potential conflict over Taiwan, the United States cannot fight the 1991 Gulf War. It cannot mass a 4-carrier armada, park it inside the strait, and wait. The People's Liberation Army Navy, and more importantly the PLA Rocket Force, has spent roughly 20 years building a system specifically designed to deny that option. Anti-ship ballistic missiles with ranges exceeding 1,500 kilometers, DF-21D and DF-26 platforms that have been publicly assessed as capable of targeting surface ships at sea, a coastal defense network layered across the first island chain that turns any concentration of high-value surface assets into a targeting problem for the United States rather than for China. The Navy has known this since approximately 2007, when internal assessments of the DF-21D program began circulating in earnest. The response, developed through the 2010s and formalized in the early 2020s under the distributed maritime operations concept, is straightforward in principle and difficult in execution. Disperse the force, push unmanned systems to the front, and remove the lucrative concentrated target that an adversary's missile inventory is optimized to destroy. 4 destroyers, spread across a cordon that covers the approaches to a choke point, are dramatically harder to target as a package than 1 carrier strike group. They are also dramatically cheaper to lose. If you want to understand why this matters well beyond the Strait of Hormuz, stay with this channel. The strategy behind the headline is the only thing worth knowing. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers at its narrowest navigable point. Roughly 21 million barrels of oil transit it daily, accounting for approximately 20% of global petroleum supply. By any measure, it is the single most consequential maritime choke point on Earth from an energy security standpoint. Iran has been aware of this leverage since at least the tanker wars of the 1980s, and its naval doctrine has historically centered on the ability to threaten or close the strait through a combination of fast attack craft, mining, coastal missile batteries, and submarine harassment of commercial shipping. What is less often examined is the geometry of the blockade from the other direction. For the United States to run a maritime interdiction operation in the Strait of Hormuz, it does not need to fight its way in. It needs to control the approaches. Bandar Abbas sits on the Iranian coastline at the northern edge of the strait, where the Hormuz Island Channel narrows. Chabahar sits further east on the Gulf of Oman coast, Iran's deep-water port with direct access to international shipping lanes bypassing the strait entirely. A cordon covering both approaches does not require presence inside the strait. It requires coverage of the exit corridors, and that coverage can be maintained by a small number of surface vessels equipped with long-range targeting and cooperative engagement capability. 4 DDGs, each carrying 96 vertical launch cells loaded with a mix of SM-6 air defense missiles, Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, and maritime strike variants, represents a combined magazine depth of 384 cells across the cordon. Each ship is equipped with Aegis Baseline 9 combat system, which allows cooperative engagement, the ability to share targeting data across the formation so that one ship can launch based on radar picture generated by another ship or by an unmanned sensor. That last detail is the operationally significant one, and it is the detail the Hormuz Cordon introduced for the first time in a live interdiction context. CENTCOM's after-action statement confirmed that Saildrone Surveyor class unmanned surface vessels operated as a persistent sensor screen ahead of the DDG Cordon. The Saildrone Surveyor is a large autonomous vessel, approximately 22 meters in length, equipped with radar, electro-optical sensors, and communication relay capability. It carries no weapons. It finds contacts, classifies them, and passes the track to manned platforms that hold the magazine. In the Hormuz operation, Saildrone vessels provided the forward sensor coverage while the DDGs remained further back, outside the envelope of Iranian coastal defense systems, and acted on the targeting data being relayed from the unmanned screen. That is a new operational capability. It was not tested in combat before July 2026. The Hormuz Cordon was its introduction, and CENTCOM confirmed it publicly. Consider what that sensor architecture looked like in practice during those 11 days. The Saildrone vessels maintained station at distances of 30 to 50 nautical miles ahead of the nearest DDG, well inside Iranian coastal surveillance range but below the engagement threshold of Iran's shore-based anti-ship batteries. Every surface contact in the Cordon zone was tracked continuously. When an Iranian tanker or cargo vessel attempted to transit, the Saildrone's electro-optical suite captured hull markings, course, and speed, classified the contact against a database of known Iranian-flagged and Iranian-affiliated vessels, and pushed the track to the lead DDG's Combat Information Center in near real time. The boarding teams, embarked on rigid hull inflatable boats carried by the destroyers, were vectored onto targets by Saildrone contact solutions rather than by manned helicopter reconnaissance. That removes one of the most vulnerable steps in a traditional maritime interdiction operation, the low-altitude helicopter exposure, from the sequence entirely. What the 11 days also produced, and what has not been widely reported, is a dataset on Iranian counter-surveillance behavior. IRGC Navy fast attack craft made multiple approaches to the Cordon perimeter over the course of the operation, probing the response threshold and attempting to shadow individual Saildrone units. Several of those approaches came within visual range of unmanned hulls. On none of those occasions did the Iranian craft cross into the engagement envelope of the DDGs. The Cordon held not because Iran was physically incapable of contesting it, but because the geometry of the unmanned sensor screen meant that any aggressive move against the screen would have constituted an action close enough to a U.S. manned asset to trigger a proportional response the IRGC Navy was not prepared to absorb. The unmanned layer created a buffer that functioned simultaneously as a sensor and a diplomatic threshold marker. Cross the drone, and you have crossed into the Americans. Stay back from the drone, and the Cordon remains intact. That interaction pattern is new doctrine. It exists in the operational record now. It did not before July 2026. One detail in the CENTCOM statement that received almost no analytical attention: the phrase persistent global maritime domain awareness. The Cordon had a geographic boundary. The interdiction authority, as framed in the legal and operational documentation, did not. Iranian-flagged vessels that transited out of the Persian Gulf through the strait before the Cordon was established were tracked by Saildrone and P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol assets operating from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar and from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. Several of those vessels were intercepted and boarded in international waters well outside the Hormuz Cordon zone, in the Arabian Sea and as far east as the approaches to the Strait of Malacca. Most people assume a naval blockade is defined by a geographic box drawn on a map. The evidence from July 2026 tells a different story. The interdiction authority was not bounded by the Cordon. It traveled with the targeted vessel class. That distinction matters enormously for the Taiwan scenario. There is a specific boarding operation from Day 7 of the Cordon that illustrates precisely how that traveling authority worked in practice. A medium tonnage tanker, Iranian flagged with a Marshallese management company listed as nominal operator, had cleared the strait 48 hours before the Cordon was formally established. By the time the Cordon went live, the vessel was in the northern Arabian Sea, running without AIS transponder, using a course pattern consistent with a transfer at sea rendezvous with a Chinese-owned shuttle tanker. A P-8 Poseidon out of Diego Garcia reacquired the contact using radar and electro-optical sensors, established a continuous track, and passed the classification to 5th Fleet. A DDG that had briefly departed the Cordon for a scheduled fuel replenishment was redirected east. The boarding happened approximately 340 nautical miles outside the Hormuz Cordon zone, in international waters, under legal authority derived from a UN Security Council resolution that was nearly 15 years old and had never previously been applied in this geographic context. The tanker was escorted to Fujairah. The cargo was documented. The vessel was released. The legal precedent was set without fanfare. That sequence, from P-8 reacquisition to boarding, to legal documentation to release, is the procedural template for a global dispersed interdiction operation. It does not require a carrier. It does not require geographic proximity to a declared cordon. It requires persistent surveillance coverage and a surface combatant close enough to act on a targeting solution within the time window the vessel cannot maneuver out of. Let's set the Hormuz operation aside for a moment and look at the chessboard it was rehearsing on. The Taiwan Strait is 180 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. It is not a choke point in the classical Hormuz sense. It is wide enough that a naval blockade of Taiwan would not be run through the strait itself. A Chinese naval blockade of Taiwan, which PLA doctrine has gamed extensively under what analysts call joint blockade campaign modeling, would be run by controlling the approaches, the Luzon Strait to the south, which separates Taiwan from the Philippines at roughly 350 kilometers width, and the passage north of Taiwan toward Japan's southwestern island chain, the Nansei Shoto. Closing those approach corridors effectively seals Taiwan's sea lines of communication without requiring PLA surface forces to operate in the strait itself. The American countermove to that scenario, which is the scenario the Pentagon considers most strategically dangerous in the 2026-2030 window, requires exactly what was rehearsed in the Strait of Hormuz, the ability to run a counter-blockade or an interdiction cordon targeting PLA Navy surface forces and Chinese commercial shipping, with a dispersed, low-signature force that is not concentrated in a way that makes it a viable target for the DF-21D and DF-26 magazine. 4 DDGs, spread across the Luzon Strait and the Miyako Strait north of Taiwan, using Saildrone sensor screens and cooperative Aegis engagement, and backed by a targeting authority that extends globally to Chinese-flagged commercial vessels anywhere in the international shipping lanes, is a direct functional equivalent to what CENTCOM ran off Bandar Abbas and Chabahar in July 2026. There is a line in the post-operation brief that stuck with me when I went through the CENTCOM documentation: minimum manned surface presence consistent with interdiction objectives. That phrase is not accidental. It is doctrine language, and it is being inserted into the public record deliberately. The minimum manned surface presence consistent with interdiction objectives off the Iranian coast was 4 DDGs. The minimum manned surface presence consistent with interdiction objectives in the Luzon Strait, operating against PLA Navy surface combatants in a high-threat environment, is a harder calculation. But the concept is identical. The 11 days left a mark in the flight logs. Seahawks lifted off the deck before dawn, radar scopes stayed lit around the clock, and arrested landings kept stacking up on the angled flight deck, proof that the tempo could be held, not just opened. A 4 DDG cordon running continuous interdiction operations for 11 days, without a carrier, without a cruiser, and without surface losses established operational endurance data for the DMO concept in a live environment. That data did not exist before July 2026. There had been exercises. There had been freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea using dispersed surface groups. There had been Red Sea operations against Houthi missile and drone threats that gave the Navy significant combat data on Aegis performance under stress. But a continuous interdiction cordon, with boarding operations, with Saildrone forward sensor coverage, with cooperative engagement across a geographically dispersed formation, had never been run for 11 continuous days in a contested maritime environment before. The operational rhythm that CENTCOM established, 4-ship rotation with periodic port calls, staggered to maintain minimum 2 DDG coverage at all times, is directly portable to the Taiwan scenario. The difference in distance and threat environment is significant. The operational template is the same. The logistics footprint that sustained the cordon is worth examining in detail, because it is also doctrine. The 4 DDGs were resupplied at sea twice during the 11 days using the USNS Charles Drew, a Lewis and Clark-class dry cargo ship operating from the Diego Garcia Logistics Hub. The fuel and ordnance replenishment operations were conducted at night, outside the surveillance range of Iranian shore-based radar, and were coordinated through the same Aegis cooperative network that managed the cordon's sensor picture. The destroyers never had to break station simultaneously. The resupply cycle was built into the rotation schedule so that at no point did the cordon fall below the 2-hull minimum that CENTCOM's rules of engagement required for boarding authority. Sustained maritime interdiction at minimum manned presence requires a logistics architecture as carefully designed as the sensor architecture. The Hormuz operation validated both in the same 11-day window. Here is the piece of the board that most analysis has not engaged what China has to do now. Watch the Type 052D destroyer on its own patrol track. Watch the Ohio-class ballistic submarine slip beneath the surface in the same ocean. One crew is searching for an answer the other side has not yet shown. Beijing observed the Hormuz Cordon. PLA Navy observers and intelligence collection assets were almost certainly present in the region, using the commercial shipping traffic and diplomatic cover available in the Gulf. The People's Liberation Army has a persistent intelligence collection problem in the Pacific. It can model American capabilities from open-source data, from previous operations, and from its own exercise observations. But it had not seen Aegis Baseline 9 and Saildrone cooperative engagement operate in a live interdiction environment. Now it has. What it observed is that the United States ran a credible maritime interdiction operation with 4 surface combatants and an unmanned sensor screen, sustained it for 11 days, and demonstrated a global targeting authority that extended beyond the Cordon's geographic boundary. From Beijing's perspective, the implication for the Taiwan scenario is direct. If the U.S. can do this with 4 DDGs off Iran, it can threaten the sea lanes that supply China's economy with a dispersed force that the DF-21D and DF-26 were not built to answer. China moves roughly 11 million barrels of oil per day through sea lanes these patrols already cross. A freedom of navigation track through the South China Sea, a Seahawk dropping a sonar buoy over open ocean, a narco-submarine vessel interested in international waters, each one is a data point Beijing reads on its own radar scope. The DF-21D was built to kill a carrier parked in one targetable location. It was not built to answer dispersed DDGs and unmanned vessels working the full width of the Pacific Ocean. The PLA's anti-access and area denial architecture, A2AD in the shorthand, was built to push American carriers out of the Western Pacific and deny the U.S. the ability to contest PLA operations in the near seas. It was not built to protect Chinese commercial shipping in the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, and the Western Pacific shipping lanes simultaneously, against a dispersed American surface force that presents no concentrated target and carries global interdiction authority. That is the strategic asymmetry the Hormuz Cordon revealed. One manned hull can cover more ocean than a DF-21D battery can range, and the U.S. just showed it can maintain that coverage with 4. There is an uncomfortable analysis that needs to be stated plainly, and it will generate some disagreement. The July 2026 Hormuz Cordon was, from a purely strategic standpoint, significantly more important as a signal to Beijing than it was as a coercive instrument against Tehran. The Iranian economy had already absorbed multiple rounds of maximum pressure sanctions. Its oil export revenues, while reduced by the Cordon, were not eliminated. Iranian crude continued to move through overland routes to Iraq and through transfers in the Gulf of Oman that the Cordon's rules of engagement chose not to intercept. 11 days of maritime interdiction did not fundamentally alter Iran's strategic calculus. What it did do in 11 days was give the U.S. military a live-fire operational record of DMO interdiction that no exercise could replicate. We will say plainly what most analysis has skirted. The Iran Cordon was chosen partly because Iran was the safest adversary against which to run the demonstration. Tehran's response options were constrained by the nuclear negotiations, by the domestic economic situation, and by the recognition that escalating against U.S. destroyers would risk the kind of kinetic exchange that would end the talks entirely. Beijing faces no such constraints in a Taiwan scenario, but it was watching a scenario in which the U.S. ran the operation it would need to run against a much more capable adversary, against an adversary that could not effectively respond, and came out with 11 days of clean operational data. That is not cynical. That is what a carrier strike group does when it holds the strait. It sails into international waters, runs freedom of navigation patrols, and puts the demonstration on screen for every satellite overhead to read. There is a question this operation leaves open, and it is the right one to carry out of this analysis. How does Beijing answer a global dispersed interdiction threat to its sea lines of communication? The PLA Navy has been building toward a blue water capability for roughly 2 decades. Its surface fleet, centered on the Type 05 Saildrone high-class cruiser and the Type 052D destroyer, has genuine deep-water capability. It has commissioned its 3rd carrier, Fujian, a conventionally powered vessel with electromagnetic launch systems that broadly matches Western carrier aviation capability in terms of aircraft handling, if not yet in terms of integrated air wing. It has been expanding its overseas basing access, with Djibouti providing a logistics node in the Western Indian Ocean, and ongoing negotiations with several Pacific Island states about access arrangements that have not yet produced binding basing agreements. But a global dispersed counter-interdiction capability, the ability to protect Chinese commercial shipping in the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, and Western Pacific simultaneously against a threat that presents no concentrated surface target, requires a surface and submarine presence the PLA Navy cannot currently sustain. It requires a logistics tail, a maintenance and sustainment network, and an intelligence architecture to track U.S. dispersed forces that China is still building. That is the geometric dead end the Hormuz operation mapped. The U.S. ran a 4-ship interdiction cordon that threatens a real strategic vulnerability. Chinese dependence on imported energy and raw materials moving through sea lanes that China's current force structure cannot defend comprehensively. The board does not resolve cleanly from here. 2 variables stay genuinely open, visible in every radar scope sweep, in every MH-60 Seahawk turning outbound over open ocean horizon, searching for a contact that has not yet surfaced. The first is the Saildrone and unmanned surface vessel program's operational scale. Saildrone Surveyor is an impressive system. The U.S. currently operates it in numbers that can cover specific corridors. A truly global dispersed interdiction network, covering the major shipping lanes simultaneously, requires an unmanned surface fleet that is still under acquisition. The contract vehicles are in place, the numbers are not. China will have watched the Hormuz Cordon and noted that the U.S. ran it with however many unmanned hulls were available in theater, not with the full global network that DMO doctrine envisions. The gap between current capability and full DMO implementation is a window, and Beijing is aware of it. The second variable is Allied participation. The Hormuz Cordon was a U.S.-only operation. In the Taiwan scenario, the interdiction network the U.S. needs to run would require basing access, logistical support, and potentially active surface contribution from Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. The EDOK basing agreements with the Philippines expanded in 2023 to include 4 additional sites with direct relevance to Luzon Strait coverage are real. Japanese destroyer participation in cooperative Aegis exercises is real. Whether those partnerships translate to active participation in a combat interdiction operation against PLA Navy forces is a commitment that remains deliberately ambiguous in every public statement from Tokyo, Canberra, and Manila. That ambiguity is not an oversight. It is a choice by all parties, and it is the unresolved alliance variable the Hormuz Cordon did not answer. What do you think? Does the U.S. have the unmanned fleet depth to sustain this doctrine globally, or is the Hormuz Cordon a capability that only works when the U.S. chooses the theater and the adversary? Drop it in the comments. The carrier did not move for Iran. The cordon was never about Tehran's oil revenues.
Destroyers and a screen of unmanned hulls held a maritime interdiction cordon for 11 days in the Strait of Hormuz, demonstrated a global targeting authority, and logged the operational data that DMO doctrine needed to move from exercise to record. The audience sat in Beijing and read every line. The geography that argument was made in does not favor China. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide and 20% of world oil. The shipping lanes China depends on run through waters the U.S. can contest from dispersed positions that present no concentrated target. The 4 DDGs have come home. The operational record they created has not moved. If you want the next read on where the board moves from here, including what the PLA's response options actually look like and which choke point is most likely to be the next demonstration point, subscribe to Blue Water.
The next move on the board is already in motion. The message from the Hormuz Cordon, for the country that was actually meant to receive it, reads as follows. America no longer needs to mass its fleet to interdict your sea lanes. It needs 4 ships, a drone screen, and the legal authority to act. That authority does not expire when the cordon lifts. Power is not what you can park in a strait. It is what you can sustain across every ocean simultaneously, without showing the fleet.